I am here with Mona Sobhani on the Middle Way podcast. Mona, it's a pleasure to be having this conversation. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited.
So, just to set the stage for our conversation today, I wanted to start out with a quote from your book, and the book is Proof of Spiritual Phenomena, a neuroscientist's discovery of the ineffable mysteries of the universe. So, you write in your book, at the beginning of this journey, I would have been the least likely person to tell this story. I was vehemently opposed to religion and spirituality because science was my religion. And I wanted to start off with that quote for two reasons. One, because as you read in your book, there's this journey of the you before going through some sort of process of transformation or initiation. And then there's the you after that. And so I want to hear about that story. But you also write that your religion was science. And so I want to touch on that too. And hopefully we can get to that in our conversation as well. But if it's okay with you, let's start with you and your background. And I'm just curious to hear about your life growing up and, what that was like and what sort of beliefs or philosophies existed inside of your family system. And how did you come to be the you before the new you?
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm Persian. My parents are or would be Muslim if they subscribed to a religion, but like that's the heritage. But they my family's not religious at all. My mother's has always been very spiritual, so she will, mention Jesus and Mary or like spiritual figures. We used to always roll our eyes. But yeah, so she's pretty spiritual, but my dad's actually kind of anti-religion as well. I think my parents actually came to the US before the Iranian Revolution, but they ended up staying here because of the state of affairs in Iran. And I guess for those not familiar, Iran had a secular government before the Iranian Revolution. And then with the revolution, they instituted this theocracy with Islam at the helm. So I think that, I don't want to talk about it too much because they're kind of scary. But I would just say that, my parents couldn't go home to their homeland. So I don't blame my dad for having a distaste for religion. And I think that's where it comes from. But yeah, we didn't grow up like, um, you know, talking about religion a lot. The only one in the family who would say anything spiritual is my mom, and it would just be kind of offhand. But my parents really believed in letting us come to our own conclusions. And they're very accepting. So I feel like no matter what we would have believed in or not believed in, they don't really have an opinion on it. So I grew up in that kind of environment. And when I was in middle school, and I don't know why this happened, but I was thinking about Islam and religion and kind of just sat down and analyzed it in my head. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense at all. And so I was just like, no, religion is garbage. It's not real. And I don't really know why again, but I also like the internet was just, coming around or whatever. And I remember I went on and I found, I was like, what about a religion that worships nature? Does that exist? Because I love nature. And I found Wicca. So for like a year in seventh grade, I was considered myself Wiccan.
Nice. I
Um,
feel like everyone had a Wicca phase in seventh grade.
yeah. And it was because I just love the moon, the full moon and whatever. So so that was it. And then in high school, nothing really, I didn't believe or disbelieve anything. I don't even remember thinking about it really. And it wasn't until 9/11 when 9/11 happened. And I think that's when it happened right on the cusp of when I was graduating high school and going into college. And that kind of radicalized me against religion and just really strong belief systems. And so for me, it was that where I just became intolerant to any kind of religion. or any kind of spirituality. Although I would say religion first, and then I think the anti-spirituality kind of happened as I went through as I went through college, and my major was physiology and neuroscience. And so as I, just took physics and or chemistry and biology, more and more I was like, oh, I don't understand how you even could have spirituality. Nobody talks about it. So, and you start thinking in this reductionist way about atoms and molecules, and you're like, where would spirit be? Where would the soul be? And so I was like, oh yeah, this really doesn't make sense. It really must not exist. And so that's how I ended up with that view. And then, but I was always really like attuned to synchronicities, and I had a lot of like weird coincidences in college. Um, and so I was always aware of those and kind of felt like, ooh, the universe is like mysterious and cool, which is probably part of why I liked science, to kind of look into that. Like why are things the way that they are? But then when I got to grad school, in studying cognitive neuroscience at USC, they immediately teach you that your brain is a coincidence detector, that it creates meaning out of everything, that it creates stories and narratives, and that, the external world has no meaning. It's all created through us. And so those like moments of magical meaning and coincidence that I used to revel in, that make you feel alive and like the universe is alive, were beaten out of me in graduate school. Because then something would happen and I would just be like, oh, well, it's just me, my brain detecting a coincidence and ascribing meaning to it. And so by the time I left graduate school, I was pretty, and it just happened. Like I didn't choose to be this way. It's just like the training and my experiences. It just happened that way, that I was like, well, I've just never seen evidence of spirituality. I've never needed it. And it doesn't seem to fit in my scientific worldview. Like I can't explain to you how that could exist. But I wasn't atheist, because I also knew that science had its limits, and that I was like, there's no way that we could know for sure. So I was kind of agnostic. But my friends like to tell me that I was pretty intolerant, and they felt uncomfortable, like telling me they went to church or something. And to be fair, I was judging them. So I was not a very accepting person.
Thank you for sharing that, and just kind of, reflecting on sort of a parallel process for me too. Always had a natural curiosity about spirituality and, curiosity about the universe. At some point in college early on, I started reading like Richard Dawkins and wanted to like identify as an atheist or agnostic, and took pride in that, and eventually that just crumbled as well. But so at some point you start to experience a couple moments, or let's say situations in your life that you describe as kind of an existential crisis. Can you tell us about what that was for you? What kind of initiated you? Describe going through sort of a dark night of the soul process. What were
Yeah.
the events that happened for you that initiated that process?
Yeah. So it was, and it's just interesting looking back, trying to think what happened, because life just happens to you sometimes. But I must have been, it took these two events to realize, well, the last event in particular, to realize I must not be happy, which means I don't understand what is supposed to make me happy, or not even happy, just content or whatever. I think there's too much of an emphasis on happiness in our culture. But so the first event was, so I'm Persian, as I mentioned. In our culture, we have this tradition of using, well, you could use anything, but in my family, my grandmother used to use coffee grounds to divine or intuit information about people, which I realize if you're listening to this and you're a materialist, you're going to be like, what is this? What is she saying? This is nonsense. But whatever, it's in our tradition, as it is in many other cultures around the world. It's like a thicker coffee. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Have you ever had Armenian or Turkish
Mm-mm.
coffee? So
No.
Yeah, it's, you make the coffee, you pour it in a cup with grounds, and you drink it, but you don't drink the grounds, you leave it in there, and then you flip the cup, let it dry, and it creates images. And then
Mm.
if you're lucky enough to have a reader, someone who's skilled to understand the symbolic pictures, because they're symbolic, then they'll look at your cup and then they'll tell you things about yourself or your past or your future. And so my grandmother was allegedly very good at this. She lived in Iran. I never had my coffee read by her, but my mom learned the skill from her. And my mom would always do it in our family parties in the background. It was always going on. I never even actually, I didn't even know what she was doing until I grew up. And then when I was in graduate school and I would go home on the weekends, she started reading for me. Like, we would just have coffee together, bonding. And then she would pick up the cup and just kind of look at it and tell me things. And I didn't take it seriously at all. And I was like, it's a bonding moment with your parents. So, I kind of just let her do it. But then over time, I noticed that some of the things that she would say would come true. And they would be things, not vague things. They would be really specific things. For example, like I had no reason to think that we would ever be switching labs, like rooms and or anything. And I remember months in advance she would say something like, oh, I think you're going to be moving, like there's some sort of movement at work, like moving locations, like moving up your office. And I remember being like, no, we're not, no, like we're in the basement, like we're never leaving. And then months later, yeah, we like randomly get the notice and we like pack up the lab and move. And then, with things like that, where I'd be like, wait, like, why is this familiar? Oh yeah, my mom said. And so there were so many of those that I started to pay attention, and my friends would get readings and then they like were on board way faster than I was. They were just like, no, but your mom's amazing. And so then that was always in the background. And so in 2016, this is the event. In 2016, my mom, I let her do the readings. I took notes for like over 10 years, and I was like, I don't know how it works. I can't explain it with science. I can't reconcile it, but it works. I mean, like if she tells me be careful not to lose money or something, I'm going to be careful not to lose money because she's usually right. So then I was in 2016, she started seeing something in the cup, and she never usually gave bad news. She tries not to, but this one, she said, oh, I've been seeing it for a while. I feel like I have to warn you because it keeps coming up. Like it's been in your cup for weeks, and I don't know what it is exactly, but I think you should expect to get bad news. And so I was like, great, like let me live in terror now for weeks. So, and then every week after that, I would go home and she kept seeing it and she just kept saying, yeah, just expect some bad news. And then, she'd do her, as a mother, try to be like, it's fine, whatever it is, it's okay, we'll make it through. And so 5 weeks later, I got a message from a classmate that said that one of our professors had been killed by one of the students. And it was a really unusual case, right? It was just really unusual. So I called my mom and told her, I was like, I think I know what it is, because I knew this professor. I mean, everyone in the program knows everyone, but he had helped me on one of my experiments for my dissertation. And so I called my mom and told her, and she was like, yeah, what I saw was a death. And she's like, that's why I didn't want to tell you, because I didn't want to like pre-upset you, like upset you before it happens. And I didn't want to, like, what if it didn't come true? Like, who knows how this stuff works? Then you'd be sad and worried for no reason. So she also said it was extremely unusual, and she actually didn't know how to interpret it because she'd never seen anything like it before. So she's like, I just knew for certain it was a death. And she's like, I knew it was luckily outside of your like house, meaning it's not, someone like in your life every day, but someone outside. And she like gave some more details that, to respect the person's privacy, I won't share, but they were like true. And they were things that there's no way she could know. Like I would never talk about him, like she doesn't read the news. Like she's just like a little old person lady. Um, so it was creepy. And then so I was upset about obviously the event that happened, but I was really upset that she predicted, something, that she saw it basically weeks in advance. And I was like, what does that mean? Was it written in his stars? Like, is there such a thing as fate or destiny? And like, can you always know? Do things change? I just things I don't know that I ever thought about that stuff in depth before, but that event really made me stay up at night terrified of the universe and
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, what is this? And it also made me really question my science a little bit, although not really, I didn't do anything about it, but I was a little bit like, wow, I've already had 10 years of believing her and having it work, but for some reason, this event, probably because it was so emotional, this one I was just like, oh my gosh, what does this mean? Like, the time doesn't only flow forward, that we do have access to other information, and like, how is she getting it? And but I didn't again, I had started a new job, I was busy, I didn't have time to think about. I was also like in grief for a while, so everything was foggy. And then 2 years later, and she started seeing this. Oh, and then at this point, I was kind of like, I liked my job and I liked the stuff we were doing. But again, like I said, there was something missing. Like, I wasn't totally fulfilled. And this is my hindsight psychological analysis of myself. But I think that I wasn't happy or fulfilled with whatever was going on in my life. And so my mom saw this relationship coming in the cup, and I was like, okay, this is gonna fill the hole. This is gonna save me from everything. And okay, so the relationship came, and it was like, okay, and then we broke up. And then so two things happened. So first, my mom had seen the outcome being positive, and in the moment, I didn't think it was positive, right? Obviously, I was like upset. And so I was like, you were wrong. And she was really rarely wrong. And she was so right about, like, it was so weird. She would always describe him in the same way. Like, and she never saw him in person, but she would describe his posture, the way his hair was, his personality, things like that. And then she so she got that wrong. And so I was like, great, what does that mean now? Was I wrong? Was this wrong all along? But all the other details were accurate. So then I was like, so can outcomes change? Like, you saw it, did it change? Is that why, and in hindsight, it was a positive outcome. So
Not the
it was,
way you're expecting, though.
yeah, just not the way that I was expecting it to be. But so that happened. And then the second thing was that, since I had like psychologically put hope on that as the thing that would save me, which it wouldn't have, right? Like, eventually I would have realized that it wouldn't have made me happy forever, because I was the problem. So like, I was the unhappiness is like within you, right? So but I saw him as like my life raft. And then once that was gone, I was just like total despair. And like, I used to be very excited for the future, very optimistic, um, you know, annoyingly to the people around me, very peppy. And then I just completely like became depressed, and I like could not muster an ounce of hope. Like, utter despair, which I'd never experienced before, ever. So I was also upset by that, by like, oh my God, why do I feel this way? What is the problem? And that's what tipped me off to, it's not the relationship, because believe me, it did not warrant that kind of emotional reaction. So that's what started tipping me off to something else must be going on. But I was too depressed to do anything about it. So it was really a dark night of the soul. Like, I didn't know that terminology at the time, but it was just a very, very dark time. And I still went out and went to see people, and went to my job and stuff. I could still function, but I was very like low energy. Like, I think of myself as being very dim, dim at that time. Uh, so that, yeah, those are does that answer the question?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm curious, Mona, like during that time, especially in the initial periods of starting to see your mom's readings come to fruition, how you were thinking about that as a skeptic. And I know, if I kind of am reading it right, I think you still have a skeptical brain. I mean, we'll get into the science, but you're looking at spirituality almost from a skeptical perspective. You want to see the evidence for it. So walk me through kind of how you were thinking about these phenomena from a skeptical perspective. Like, we could, people might say, well, this is confirmation bias. Like, you're just, looking for the certain only the events that came true, and that's obviously like confirming your whatever bias you have. So what was that process like, and how would you respond to that skeptical part, if you have a response?
Yeah, I was I couldn't reconcile it or explain it. I just couldn't. I think I really just lived in cognitive dissonance and didn't bother to um need to understand it scientifically, because I really don't remember thinking about it in depth. And I think it's because when I like if my mind was a library of scientific knowledge, there was no section to go to for this. So I might have stopped to think about it, but I'm like, oh, there's no shelves here, there's no books, so can't explain it. And I would just wouldn't think about it because I didn't have any framework to understand it at all. Because I'm not like a physicist either. I have a basic understanding of physics, but not well enough to debunk, psychic phenomena. So um I was always skeptical, and I always thought, because the training, as you know, goes deep. I mean, you're like really rewired to be that way, not just think in a certain way. And so, and like I said, I have this whole identity around being a scientist and being a smart, serious scientist. And so believing in those kinds of things threatened that identity. And so I didn't want to. So I mean, yeah, I lived kind of inauthentically, because like in public, I was attacking that kind of stuff. And then in private, I was getting readings from my mom. So I mean, I'm still always skeptical, which is, yeah, it's funny. It's true. I'm still like, I don't know when I'll fully be convinced, really. Um, may never be. Like, I believe it, but then I don't believe it. But so I don't know. Yeah, so I mean, I always, every time something would come true, I'd be like, oh, it's confirmation bias. But when this is also the thing that's hard to explain to people, because if you don't engage in these kinds of experiences, it is really hard to understand how powerful they are in the moment. And when it happens enough times over 10 years, like I'm lucky enough to have someone in my family who does it for me, who's not trying to impress me. I'm not paying her, right? Like, there's no fraud going on. It's like my mom. And she's also not guessing. Like, it's actually more of a technical skill. So she'll be like, look, you can see this is, and you can see them, you can see the pictures. She's like, this is a turtle. It means something's moving slowly and you can see the turtle. So it's like, when enough of that happens, you just become not convinced that it's real, like, but whatever this like situation is, you come to cautiously trust it, I guess, is what I would say I came to do. And but with that like big event in 2016, I think I came to like have even more respect for them, right? Because it was like what are you tapping into? Like, what is the underlying nature of this reality? So yeah, I mean, and I'm still, if I get readings, I'm still always skeptical, and readers are supposed to validate for you. They're supposed to give you like good proof, like that something only you would know. So yeah, if you don't, if you're getting a reading and you don't get that, then it's probably not a good intuitive.
Hmm. I really like this because I think, what you're describing is like this experience of sort of being on the edge of knowing and not knowing. There were these events that happened that where you had one certain view of the world and you knew the way things were, and it created a sense of doubt or an openness to something else. And I think the tendency then is to want to know that that other way of seeing the world for sure is true. But I also think there's something about like spirituality and as you say in the title of your book, like these ineffable mysteries of the universe that like we can't know. And there's always this experience of like, I want to know for sure, what's true, but it's mysterious, and maybe that's by design. So
Yeah,
the gift there is opening us up into this experience of not knowing, maybe.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It took me a very long time to accept that. And when you think about, I mean, when you think about science and the way that our, mainstream Western culture is, it's all about certainty, evidence-based, data-driven. There's a lot of, but the nature of the universe is unknowable. And, but when you're trained in that way, that's what the crux of the whole book is I was trained to, where's the proof? I need proof to believe. But yeah, then you come up against this literal mystery, and like that the nature of it is unknowable, on purpose, I believe. Like, the whole point is to, yeah, you can come at it with your I need certainty, but it's just going to continue to give you uncertainty, and you have to accept that. But whew, is that hard when you
Yeah,
come from our training?
absolutely. So, you went through kind of what I think, or how I see it, like a really classic dark night of the soul process. Like you knew who you were actually very certain about it, very fixed in your identity. That all got stripped away. You didn't know who you were, where you were going, or in this dark place. And then you start to reform some new experience of yourself. So where does that leave you today? And kind of just, I know it's a broad question, but like, what is your outlook on how the world works? How does the universe work? And how does that differ from where you were, at the beginning of this journey?
Yeah, I thought we could know everything eventually. Maybe not for a long, long time in humanity's future, but I thought eventually we could. But I came to that, it's what we just, yeah, said. Like, I came up against uncertainty and really resisted it for so long, which is where all the suffering came from. Eventually, I like to think of it like the universe beat me into submission, because there's only so much suffering you can take until you're finally like, I'm just gonna let go now. I'm just gonna let it go. Because whatever I'm holding on to is not working. And I just need to, and that's what happened in the journey. Was I was clinging to this scientific principles, my identity. And but I would read all this literature, I'd read all these interesting things that I'm sure we'll talk about, that would like threaten it, like shake my identity. And I couldn't let go of it. And at some point there came a tipping point where it was just like this, oh God, I'm thinking about it is giving me like panic attack, like this nightmare time when it's like I had all this evidence, like I read all this stuff, like there's just so much we don't learn in normal science, all these spiritual texts and philosophies, other worldviews, and other scientific evidence. And then my core identity of, I used to look down on people who believed in these other things. And like now I'm between these two worlds. And do I stay where I was, or do I become the person I used to hate? And that was the dark night, because letting go was like everything I knew, and what my like sense of security. But it was also making me so unhappy. Like I was not happy where I was. And this new stuff was like filling my soul with like passion, and like I was excited, for the first time in a long time. And so it was like this dichotomy, and I had to make a choice. And it was like I can cling to, but and in doing that, it was that part of that scientist ego was certainty. Like I need to have certainty, I need to have scientific proof. This is the definition of proof, double blind randomized clinical trial. And then at some point I was like, like I started stepping back. I started stepping way back, and actively being like, okay, just let that go, let that go. Like, because these thoughts would come like that, just like I said. I'd be like, no, I need a clinical trial. And then I'd be like, okay, let that go for a second. And what if there are things in the universe that cannot be measured with a double-blind clinical trial. And so now we're saying the only acceptable evidence to understanding reality can be in this one format. And when you step back and look at it like that, I thought, that's preposterous. Like, that is so preposterous. And when you look at the evolution of humans, you're like, man, we barely know anything. Like, we barely scratched the surface. But at every moment we act like we're now the experts on everything.
Mm.
And I'm like, at some point we're going to realize something better than the double blind trial or whatever. And but we stand here with certainty. And so I just kept doing that and stepping back and thinking, but yeah, what if the nature, I just started looking at the assumptions in science too, like the assumption that things are reproducible, that they're constant, that all those things. I'm like, these are assumptions. And yes, most of the things we've been able to measure and control are that way, but not everything. And how do we know that the universe is uniform throughout? How do we know all forces are reproducible? Like, we don't really know that. It's just an assumption.
Mm.
And so when I thought about it in that way, I thought, well, yeah, what if there's like, we don't know what dark matter is. What if dark matter is something that's super variable that you can't measure in a reproducible way? But if we limit the way that we measure and understand our reality, we're never gonna discover that. And so once I started doing that, it got easier to be like, you know what, we just don't know. And like, I'm clinging to boundaries and limits that we've placed on ourselves for no reason or because they've worked for us best thus far. But like, if you're just thinking about philosophy and a way of life, like, I don't have to cling to that. I can let go
Mhm.
and open my mind.
Mhm. You note in the book how there's actually a much lower rate of replicability of research studies, even the most widely accepted and mainstream research studies, than we would expect. And these, I don't know the exact numbers, but something fairly low, maybe like 20-30% or something in that range.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you can touch on that a little bit. And, I don't know if you came across in looking in the, in research into like, consciousness and spiritual phenomenon. But it's kind of similar. I mean, it doesn't really differ from the replication problem in mainstream science. And I know that some scientists even, propose that there's an experience, there's a bias there, like our expectations about the outcome will influence the outcome. And so it's the reason why it's so hard to replicate those studies. So what have you noticed in that regard?
Yeah, even before I went down this path, even when I was just normal, my old school scientist, that was one of the things that dismayed me about neuroscience and psychology research in general, is that even, oh man, and just the way it's like portrayed in the media and discussed by people, oh, it just like makes me sick that people like love mentioning the brain and mentioning parts of the brain like we know anything at all. But it's, if they only knew behind the scenes. And look, science is great. I'm not, there is too much anti-science these days. It's great for a lot of things, but there is a lot of variability in the nature of the universe, in nature, in biology. There's so much variability. So it's already, when you're doing, like, as like you do 20 different studies, you can get 20 different results. And even if everything's identical, just by the nature of the way things are. And then on top of that, people always change experiments, like they change something about it. So it's like, actuality, no experiments are identical. And sometimes I think it's like a miracle at all that anything's reproducible. But like, the stronger the effect, the better. But so it was already very disappointing. Like, these, it should tip us off to, especially psychology, like that these underlying constructs that we just like to label and put in conceptual frameworks, they're much more complicated than we give them credit for. So you already have that kind of low reproducibility, people can't even agree on concepts. They can't agree on measures. So scientists are human, right? Like there's so much disagreement and scholarly debate about all these topics. So when you look outside of when I started looking at this other literature, like psychic phenomena or whatever, that's why I was surprised, because I already remembered that we have like a pretty low reproducibility rate, but like some of those studies were more reproducible, or like they had similar effect sizes to some of the stuff that we study, and they use some of the same exact same experimental protocols that we use. So it's not like some protocol that I wouldn't recognize, that I wouldn't know how to judge, right? And so I think that, yeah, and with the psychic phenomena, like, um, scientific literature, like I'm not tied to it, but I do think that it's like if you want to disprove that, you're going to have to throw out a lot of our other research because
Exactly.
it's like stands on similar footing.
We,
So,
yeah, we hold ourselves to certain standards, which is, we want to see a randomized control trial, and not all of the, psi research are randomized control trials, but we also accept, science when there's been meta-analyses, when there's at least a small to medium effect size. So if we take all of those as like you know, the rules of whether or not something is true, then it kind of forces us into at least being open to the possibility that some of these other unexplained phenomena might be true.
right.
Can we talk about that a little bit? Like, what are some of the things that you came across in the literature that were really surprising to you, or just really intriguing or interesting that you wouldn't have been open to before? And by the way, you do such a nice job in your book of synthesizing all of that literature. So, if anyone is curious about research on paranormal phenomenon or collective consciousness or reincarnation, but doesn't want to do like a deep dive into it, I recommend going to your book, because you kind of survey the whole landscape and give a nice approachable overview. But what kind of got you really, really intrigued?
Yeah, so the it started with the with my mom, and then my I got interested in divination or psychic phenomena, whatever you want to call it, and or intuitiveness. Some people just seem to know more, right? Or be able to interpret people better. So my friends and I started going to, this was just for fun, but we started going to intuitives to kind of like swap readings and see if they were vague in general. And so I just got, and they weren't, they were a lot of time. I mean, obviously it depends on the person, the skill of the reader, but it was enough that we were like, yes, sometimes they would say things where they're correct on like 7 variables about something from your past that there's just no way anyone could know. And you're just sitting there like, what is going on? So we had those kinds of, my friends and I had these personal experiences. But I did not think anyone had done research on this, because I had never heard of it. So I was like, oh, there's no way anyone has actually studied this. So I thought I didn't think I was the first person because I wasn't researching it, but I started interviewing the intuitives just so I could understand better what they were experiencing, from a neuroscience perspective. I'm like, when you say you're seeing, are you actually seeing? Or like when you say you're hearing, is it in your head? That type of thing. And so when I started doing that, I got turned on to this research institute called the Windbridge Research Center, and they had used psychic mediums. Like they ran them through multiple tests, and they like certified, quote unquote, certified them. I don't know how they have it all published, their protocol. And so they did studies with mediums. And so I reached out to them to kind of ask about that. And the guy gave me a huge reading list. And he's like, oh, a lot of scientists get in touch with me, because they have a personal experience. They come to me, they hear of our work, and they always think, because they're unaware of all the research, that nothing's been researched on this. But he said there's been over 100 years of research. Like there's a whole society for psychical research that was founded in England, that's been doing research for over 100 years. There's so many labs around the world. So it's like a lot of results have been replicated. And then I think he said there's so much work that there's been a review of all of the meta-analyses. Like there had been so much work that there had been multiple meta-analyses, and then there was a review published in 2018 of all of those. So I was just like, wait, are you serious? I was like, there's been that much research, like people are that interested in it. So of course, I'm just so naive. So he gave me all this reading to do, and I went and I read the review, and I read a bunch of books too, because there was like the US government had apparently funded a psychic research program for like 25 years from the 70s to the 90s. So I spoke to those physicists, I reached out to them, I read their books, I read their papers. And, I mean, by that point, like I said, by the standards of any other science, this was like beyond established. It was a joke. Like I was reading and I'm like, this is ridiculous. Like that anybody would even look. There's, as a normal scientist, if you come to it with an open mind and you read the stats, I mean, I invite you, and then go back and read your fields papers. I invite you to like question it, because it's pretty strong. And I know people don't like the government sometimes and think that's all misinformation, but that's why I looked at the review and the other meta-analyses, because that stuff's not necessarily related to the government. It's just labs around the world have done this kind of research. So do you want me to talk about like an example of one of the experiments?
That would be fantastic.
Yes. And so I was impressed by the sheer amount of work, by the effects. I mean, the effect sizes are small, but like I said, comparable to psychology and neuroscience studies. And just that there been so much work, and a lot of it was positive, because you might assume there's been a lot of work, but a lot of it didn't show the effect. So, and the experiments are weird. Okay, so just but, so for example, one of them is like this one is used a lot. It's trying to show that we're more connected to each other than we believe. So it's called telepathy, the idea that you can like communicate with someone through your mind. So they'll like separate two people, put them in electromagnetically shielded rooms. They'll have one person, they'll randomly select a target. So let's say there's an option of 10 pictures. They'll randomly select a picture. They'll give it to the person, and then the person is supposed to look at the target and send thoughts of what the target is. Like, let's say it's a mountain landscape or something, to the other person. And then the other person has no idea when they're sending the thoughts. And so the person, it's like, okay, it's just like trial. So send the thought now, don't send the thought, whatever. And so they analyzed it, and they would ask the other person, like, what are your impressions? What are you seeing? And then afterward, they would show them, choose, here are the options, choose the correct target. And so above chance level, they would choose the correct target. So another example is you can do it without another person. So just having a computer randomly select pictures and present them, and have somebody guess what the next picture is going to be. And again, above chance, they can guess which picture is going to come up. But they found that those kinds of experiments are kind of boring, actually. Like if it's like a star and like a square, like in Ghostbusters. I don't know if you remember that movie, but like those are boring. And apparently if the tasks are boring, it doesn't work as well. So you have to actually be like engaged in it. So they found that in normal neuroscience and physiology, is normal behavior, we know that humans are like physiologically aroused to things that are salient. And a lot of times that can be erotic pictures or violent pictures, or something that just kind of stimulates you and gets your attention. So they would pair pictures, targets with something, with like an erotic picture, or with, I don't know if they use violent ones, but something like that, like some sort of emotional picture. And they found that when those were paired, people could pre-guess the correct target better than chance, but also better than if they weren't paired. And so that's one. And then like this one I love, because I just think it's so weird. Daryl Bem at Cornell did the series of experiments, a bunch of them, but one of them was he split two students into groups. And we all know if you study a list of words before a test, you're more likely to remember and do well on the test. But they wanted to check retrocausality, like time flowing in the other direction. So they split students into two groups, gave one of the groups a list to, they gave them the list of words to study before and after the test. And there was a statistical difference between the groups, and the one that studied the words after the test did better on the test. And so, I mean, they're weird. They're weird experiments, but there have been hundreds of them. So like hundreds of thousands of participants, so many different types of statistical tests, Bayesian analytics, like regular regressions. And yeah, above chance, some people are better skilled at it. If it's a more interesting task, people are better at it. And there also seems to be, there does seem to be an experimenter effect. So like certain experimenters in this field get better effects than others consistently. And they call it the
Mhm.
psi experimenter effect.
Mhm.
So, which is another interesting phenomena. Like, what does that mean? We interact with the experiment, which, we know, we don't think it's like psychic, but we all know we researchers influence by the way we talk and move and interact with our participants. Um, but in those studies, I think they even they don't let the participants meet the researchers, but they somehow still affect, that you still find the difference. So there's all kinds of crazy things like that, that there's a lot of different interpretations. Um, I feel now like everything we have is so limiting. So I could tell you, I know one of the interpretations is, okay, maybe we're all interconnected by something we can't see. There could be multiple other interpretations, who knows? But the important thing is that this is like really weird research that stands, our statistical tests. What a weird phenomena. Shouldn't we look at that? I mean, it suggests a lot about our scientific paradigm.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, let's get into that a little bit about the scientific paradigm. Um, so, I mean, you've been describing this process individually of having a certain identity, a certain belief system, and as things came up that challenged that, you could either be defensive about it or write them off, or kind of be curious about them and more open to them. And, we see the same thing happening on like a macro level as well, at a more collective level. And I'm just wondering kind of, what your take is on scientism as a whole, and maybe even especially in the context of the past couple of years with COVID, and how that has sort of played out, and, the rigidity of science, and just what's happening on a more macro level with that. Are we coming up against some sort of dark night of the soul as a collective, where we're having to face our rigid belief systems and maybe opening up to some other way of experiencing the world? That's a big
Yeah,
question.
that's a good question. Let me take a moment to think about it, how to
Please.
answer it. Um, so I spent a lot of time thinking about this during and after my crisis. I mean, I don't know when the crisis ended, really. I don't know if it has, but really, I spent a lot of time thinking about it because, yeah, you're kind of like, like you said, it starts with the individual self. So it's like at first all I could do was look at myself and think, okay, why is it so hard for me to accept, let's say, those studies? Like I would read those studies and wake up the next morning and be like, oh, I've been fooled. uh and it's like, wait, and I would have to start over and run through the findings again, and this went on for a long time, and I really had to look at that eventually and be like, what is it about this that you can't accept? um and I really couldn't come to an answer for a long time until I met this psychologist. I wasn't a patient, which is why he could tell me, because in therapy they can't just tell you what's wrong with you. They really should. So I met the psychologist, and he told me, like, he heard my whole story, and he's like, yeah, oh, he's like, it's just really simple. You must have felt like you weren't smart at some point in your life, from maybe your culture, or maybe someone actually told you that, or it could be something like this when from your childhood. And so being smart is really, really important to you. And you've found, maybe, and he's like, maybe you also had uncertainty in your childhood, and so you looked for something that would give you certainty and that would make you feel smart, and maybe for you that was science. And so now that you're coming up against this this moment of you think, he's like, and you think, he's like, which may or may not be true, but you think that accepting spirituality or accepting unexplained phenomena means that you can't be a scientist anymore. And that threatens your certainty, your foundation, your identity, you being smart, and you've needed that your whole life for whatever reason. And I just like, when he told me that, I was like so offended. I was like, oh, this is so rude. I can't believe it. But I wrote it down, and then for like months, like reflected on it, went over it in my head. I was like, is it true? What happened in my childhood? Like, what is, where did this stuff come from? And it like truly takes a while to think about it and then accept it, see it. But it made sense finally. And I thought, oh, he's so right, like, and I would really have emotional bodily reactions when people would talk about spirituality and religion. I'd be like, oh, that's so stupid. And like, I would get so angry and like get hot, like, and worked up. And I started reading a lot of psychology during this time, like somatic psychology and all this stuff. And I was like, dude, like, what is my problem? Like, why do I get so worked up? And so what he said made so much sense. I'm like, I feel like when people talk about those things, they threaten my worldview and they threaten my identity, and things that I guess I felt had made me feel safe. And so once I saw that, like things just became much simpler, just much simpler. And I mean, obviously everything takes a while to integrate, even when you see it, but behavior doesn't change overnight. But at least I could become aware, like, of when that was happening, and work through the narrative in my head a little more calmly. And so that was the thing for me. And then when I thought about science more broadly, because yeah, when I was thinking about writing the book, I was terrified, and I'm like, oh my god, this is, no one's gonna accept this. But I kept reminding myself that I'm the person, like the people I'm worried about are old me. So I kept thinking, well, what did and would convince you? And like you asked, what's the problem to accepting it? And so I thought, well, yeah, first of all, is just the obvious logistics of, if you built your whole career, like money, your livelihood around science, and someone comes in and is threatening what you've studied your whole life, which is not only your ego and your identity and your life's work, but also your livelihood, of course you're going to have a negative reaction to that. It also, I think there's also just a mainstream unawareness of this kind of research, and there's a mainstream narrative that it's been studied and debunked, and that anyone who believes it is stupid or crazy or irrational, and is anti-science or pseudo, is doing pseudoscience or anti-science. So that narrative doesn't help anyone. Like, you believe it. If you believe in this, you're crazy and you're stupid. For me, the stupid was the hard one. That was the hard one. So I think that there's that going on. And I try to keep that in mind as I come out with this, that, because now I can see that for myself, when somebody would say something, present a worldview I didn't agree with, and I would attack them, I was really attacking that part of myself that whatever I didn't feel comfortable with. And so I try to just to view it like that. But I think the scientists, I think what that guy said was true. I also, based on most of the scientists I know, like, we go to science for some reason. Like, a lot of us like being arrogant. We like our superiority. We like being the people that society goes to for answers for whatever reason. And who would want to give up that power? When it comes from such a primitive place, for a lot of us. So I think, so I understand and I think there's also a narrative that to accept, like people always say, like it goes against physics, which means that they just don't understand physics and don't understand like quantum physics and don't understand that there's a lot of questions open in physics. But like I said, there's a lot of these just mainstream narratives that people don't, assumptions that no one looks past, that people just accept as, I think of it like as a veil, like it's just a veil. No one bothers to look past it. Even though it's like a sheer veil, it's not even, it's not a real boundary. It's just one we've created. So, and I also think scientists are very busy and don't have time to, go find the research. If they're not interested in it, they're just, of course, we're going to just accept the mainstream narrative because it's easy. Everyone seems to agree with it. Someone else must have read all the counter literature. I respect them. I'm gonna take their opinion and I'm
Mm,
going to talk about it as though I read all the literature as well.
right. Right.
And they have not.
Yeah, and I think that that's generally what happens in the broader public as well, amongst non-scientists, is that we want to accept their word and trust that, they've done their due diligence and considering, multiple ways of looking at things or the counter evidence. And to some degree, we need that because the scientists are smart people and they're doing science, and we can't not have any faith in it at all.
Absolutely.
But it also seems like science has become like something to believe in. And, what we're seeing now is like you're either pro science or anti science. And you see signs up in people's yard like, I believe in science. And that
I
just seems like an oxymoron to me.
know.
Um,
No, I know, stop. I know. And it's funny because like I say in the book too, like I was that person, like I had a necklace inscribed with the word science on it. Oh my God, I was, so and it is, and I hate that black and white, you're pro or you're anti. And people just, so I agree. We're in this moment. And I want to go back to, because I liked your question. I thought it was a very good one, about the uncertainty. I think that's I think what science has provided for the scientific method and has provided for us is a little bit of certainty. And everyone knows humans don't like uncertainty. It's one of the core features of us. And that's why, which is funny, like people always use that to explain why religion and spirituality work. Oh, we don't like uncertainty. We don't like not having answers. So we've created this fictional belief in spirituality and religion. But science is the exact same thing. It's like you said, it's become a belief because it does provide some certainty around particular things. It provides more certainty than we had before we had it, and people love that. But I don't know if I don't think I wrote about this in the book, but I think I've written about it in my I write a psychedelic newsletter, or not altered states of consciousness, and it's that like we that we must be certain, we have to have control.
yeah, yeah,
Control of the environment, of control over, we must know where we're going. And I found this to be true when I was beginning this journey, and I would tell people about the divination, and some people hated it because they hated the idea. Like I have a friend who was like, I control my fate. And when I told him,
right,
I was like, okay, totally. But I was like, that's interesting that that's what you took from what I said. Because I didn't say that they're, like you probably still have control over your fate, like free will, whatever. But I'm just saying you could have, whatever. So I think there's that kind of, people don't like the idea anymore of fate or destiny or something being out of their control. I think that has a lot to do with it too.
right. Yeah, that's a great point. And yeah, I mean, a sense of control, a sense of knowing. We want to know. And again, I think that I'm just kind of relating this as far as what we've been experiencing over the past few years. And understandably, we've been going, I think, through a sort of dark night of the soul as a collective, and we're hit with this pandemic, which is extremely scary and a lot of not knowing. And of course, we're going to want to feel like we're in control. We know exactly what to do and how to treat it. And this is the science. And this is exactly what we just need to get everyone on board with that. But what
Yes.
that's missing is the not knowing and the openness and the flexibility, which is truly science, to being open to taking in new pieces of information and that whole process.
Yes, and I love that you said that. So I noticed that with COVID too, and I get these New York Times newsletters in the morning, and I read them. It's like the only news I read now because I can't stand the negativity. But I noticed that with COVID, it was so interesting because in the big every day they would send a COVID update, and in the beginning it was like that. It was like the masks and this. If we could just do this, if we could get everyone, whatever. And then at some point, to their credit, it was like maybe a year ago, the New York Times sent one that said it's time to accept that COVID is a mystery, and it was like it's time to accept that despite all of our science and our best efforts and our best guesses, and then they've laid out like they're like based on this evidence we expect to see a peak during this time. We did not expect to see a peak during this time, but we have. So why is that? We don't know. We expected this variant to do this, it hasn't. Why? We don't know. And it was like, to their credit, like they're right. Like, and you're right, I think COVID is I mean, yeah, I think it's the universe being like, oh yeah, you think you know everything, like
Exactly.
certainty for you.
Exactly. Yeah, I see it the same way. And I mean, what a wonderful thing for the New York Times to do. And I think doing that actually creates more trust from in the public, in science, and in the institutions, because like we know from being human that like we can't know everything. And I think we like it when there is an expression of humility and not knowing. And we want to then, place more trust in them. So, anyways, I can go off on a tangent, but
No, I agree with you though. It does feel like that. And I've heard other people say that we're in a dark night of the soul. It's almost like we're going through an initiation to accept the unknown. And again, like how much you, having gone through one myself, how much you resist will determine how much you suffer.
yeah. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that you were sort of forced into this change in identity because of the suffering. And there's a quote that I really like from a Zen teacher, Sherry Huber, and she talks about like people coming to meditation practice or having some sort of awakening process, and she says like you do it when you suffered enough, like otherwise you just got to keep suffering. So the suffering, in a way, I see this dark night process almost as a gift, if we can look at it that way, to almost as an initiation into having some new worldview or some new experience of the world, and hopefully maybe finding some more connection and compassion with one another in the process.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, I completely agree. I have you gone through a dark night of the soul?
I have gone through Dark Night of the Soul. And, I would even say, echo what you said. I don't even know if it's over yet. And my Dark Night of the Soul probably started, I'm, turning 33 in a week, but my Dark Night of the Soul started when I was probably like 21 or 22. And I was diving into
Wow.
meditation practice and spirituality. I was living in a Zen Buddhist monastery here in Los Angeles, and probably was like experiencing some remnants of depression. So a mix between, just a mental health thing, but also from a spiritual perspective as well, and really struggling with my identity and who I was, and other people around me, commenting and noticing, as you were saying too, like just being more quiet and withdrawn, and like, is this who I really am? Like, what about the old me? Um, so I don't know if you even come out, if there's a clear point where
Yeah.
you come out the other side of that, but absolutely.
Yeah, I don't know. I still feel like I'm in it sometimes. So who knows? We'll see. God, I hope it doesn't go on forever, but this could just be existence. I don't know.
I really honor the like the courage to go through that dark night process. And as you say, like to almost become the person that you used to hate, because that must not be easy. And that must take a lot of courage to admit
So
that to ourselves.
yeah, and that's the part that I for sure, that's why part of why I say that I feel like I'm still going through it because I still have um trouble. I mean, and like I said, behavior is slow to change, and I try to actively like not hide, anymore, like my interests or things like that. Trying to be like as authentic as possible. Well, because I think before I used to edit, like who am I talking to? what do I know about what they believe? Let me engage with that side of them. I try not to do that as much anymore, but like I said, it's still a work in progress. But yeah, and just for myself, largely I've overcome that. You know, like I think in the past I would have like the even the kind of books I would buy, I would judge myself for that. And now you know, now I just try not to, now I don't do that anymore. I try anyway. Try not to do that anymore. No, I think that's over. But there are other little things I think that will be an ongoing process of like a slow integration. But yeah, it's hard to spend a lifetime, you know, yeah, looking like honestly looking down on certain people and their views, and then suddenly you're like, God, I old me would have like really looked down on this person that I am now. Um, but all you can do is, you know, be, I've tried to be comforted by the fact that I spent, you know, a lot of time thinking through this and feeling through it and experiencing through it and embracing the things I experienced and not dismissing them just because my worldview or my culture told me to. So I think that I never understood, you know, a lot of the spiritual literature before, but when they say things like be true to yourself, I'm like, oh, I get it now. I get it now. Now I get it.
Well, I thank you so much for sharing about this process for you, about your journey, being willing and open to talk about your dark night of the soul process, and also just kind of illuminating some of these cool scientific facts that many people might not know about. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about or we haven't covered today that maybe you're hoping to add?
Um, I would just invite scientists or others to get in touch with the mystical spiritual aspects of the universe and not be afraid of them. And you know, like in whatever way that you want to do that. But I do think if you, I really believe this now, if you are a scientist, and you're trying to help us map the nature of the universe and reality, I think you should probably be acquainted with more dimensions than just the ones you've been boxed into. And instead of, I mean, and that's how I try to view it now. You know, I try to lead with curiosity, which is supposed to be the true nature of science, right? Is curious and pay attention to the things that don't fit the model, because as annoying as it is to update the model, that's how you get to the truth. So I do think it's imperative, really, that scientists seek out experiences to understand other ways of being and knowing.
Hmm. Well, it'll certainly be interesting to observe what happens in the coming years in the realm of science, but also in the realm of our scientific identities as individuals and as a collective too. Thank you again for sharing all your wisdom and experiences with us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me.